Hello and welcome to Hacking State. This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me today is Nathan Worcester. Nathan, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
Good to have you. You are a journalist over at the Epoch Times, and you've done a decent amount of interesting work, especially lately. You did a lot of coverage in towns across, the Midwest and elsewhere of the recent election, and of course, you've been doing work on DOGE and some other things related to that lately. And so, I just wanted to have you on because I felt like, with everything changing post-election and with the vibe shift, there's not a lot of people that are giving takes that actually have on the ground experience with what went on. And so I was interested in talking to you as someone that, has direct experience with what was going on the campaign trails, but also, as a journalist, is just professionally very invested with the new developments that are happening post-election. And so happy to have you on. And if you could please just tell us a little bit about sort of your main areas of coverage and what you've been writing about lately.
Yeah, so I am officially a national politics reporter, but I've written about a lot of different topics. I guess I like to say I'm more of a generalist than a specialist because I just, am curious about a lot of things. So I have a subbeat focused on energy, which is another very interesting area
Mm.
because the Trump administration is creating this new, I believe, within the executive office of the president, National Energy Council or
Mhm.
National Council on Energy. Trump has written it multiple ways. But yeah, aside from that, I've written about social science, had the chance to interview some very interesting people just on that. And as you said, I've been over the past few months, less so over the past few weeks, traveling all across the country, visiting every swing state, also finding my way to states that are not swing states and getting a sense of the mood on the ground. I can tell you, just as kind of a starting point, one thing that stood out to me from early on, I'm not the only person who's made this observation, but even in the midst of the supposed summer vibe shift when Harris replaced Biden, and I think all of us were seeing coconuts and brat and all that stuff on our Twitter timelines or whatever, you go up to people, and I want to be clear, this is not like people at a Charlie Kirk event or a conservative event, but you go up to people at like a mall, or you talk to people at polling places, just anywhere. I mean, I was talking to people as just one example in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I
Mhm.
don't know how familiar you are with that area, but not far from downtown. I think like yeah, for what it's worth, predominantly Latino, predominantly Black neighborhood. And you just have conversations with people. And there was an obvious level of enthusiasm for Trump that, at least to me, I had a sense as a reporter that it existed across the country, that it was a real thing and not just an artifact of some informational silo that I found myself in. Though I do always try to make sure that I'm stepping outside of whatever silo I may end up in. But I just so consistently heard, and I would say one of the really big themes that I don't know if it has really been conveyed in some of the post-election coverage. There's obviously the gender angle, the race angle, all that stuff, but really like for me, a big dividing line that became clear was the difference between the so-called professional managerial class and their interests, their preferences,
Mm.
and in particular, entrepreneurs of any sort. The example everybody cites is any Uber driver, any Lyft driver you talk to, they are just going to start talking to you about how much they love Trump and
Yeah.
how upset they are about Biden, how bad the economy has been from their perspective, despite all of the talk that we have not been in a recession at any point over the past 2 years. And I'm skeptical of that myself. But I in Grand Rapids, I was talking to a guy who like was hauling parts for an automaker in his truck. He had like an independent business, but one very well integrated within the existing automotive industry in the state, which, as you know, even with the decline of Detroit, it's a huge source of jobs, huge source of economic dynamism, and it has knock-on effects, I think, in terms of like real-world innovation in the state.
Mm.
You're going to have, in a more meaningful way, I would argue, innovation coming out of a state that has trained machinists, trained engineers than you would in some other places, even if they're better at like abstract symbol manipulation. I'm saying this from Washington D.C. Just
Mm.
to make it more pointed. But this particular guy that I spoke to, yeah, no, like dozens of others who were similar, like small scale entrepreneurs. He really just told me the economy is bad. It has not been good for me. Um, maybe he is somewhat skeptical, or at least not fully on board with the notion that Trump is going to rejuvenate Detroit as he
Mm.
promised to rejuvenate the state, but open to that, and more, I think, just upset with the status quo of the Biden Harris administration. So I know that's a lot, but that's like I think a very, from all the takeaways that I had on the campaign trail, that one has just continued to like resonate in my mind. And yeah, just one last thing is that I said professional managerial class having a different set of interests. And one of the most stark examples of that I found was in North Carolina, going to like the Duke University campus, talking to people who are more integrated into that institution, people who, for example, might be working in some sort of administrative role where they have a 401k and they're at least maybe partly for ideological reasons, but maybe also partly for reasons that are well founded economically, pretty content with the status quo, pretty happy with the way the economy has been going. So I don't know. That's I feel like an interesting possible starting point.
So, were you surprised by the result on November 6th?
I have a colleague who I'm not going to say his name, but he was very, very confident not only that Trump would win every swing state, but that he would win the popular vote. And his basis for this was what I think is, in retrospect, very appropriate skepticism of the polling.
Hmm.
Obviously, it's been a Trump voter shyness problem for a long time. In the run up to the election, you may recall there were a lot of analyses, a lot of claims, especially from commentators on the center left or left, saying, well, actually, the pollsters have adjusted for this. They've gotten better at reaching those shy Trump voters. And also, Trump voters are loudmouths. Don't you understand that?
Hmm.
But clearly, there was a comparable gap between the poll results in the months leading up to the election and the actual results as reflected in the votes and as reflected in exit polls. Clearly, some way in which these polling agencies, these individuals and institutions entrusted with actually getting us the real facts on the ground, now almost a decade into the Trump era, are still fundamentally getting it wrong. Which for them, it ought to be just like at a very, very fundamental level, an opportunity for people in positions of responsibility, authority, seen as credible, to just, yeah, step back and really try to start from square one, just in the whole business that they have of accurately getting a sense of public sentiment.
Yeah.
Now, so I wasn't as good as my colleague, but I did anticipate Trump would win. However, I thought he would lose at least one of the blue wall states. I thought it would be a tighter race than it was, and I entertained the possibility that he could have won the popular vote, but that as came as a bit of a surprise to me as well.
Wow. Okay. I have an interesting anecdote about this, which I wasn't close to at the time, but I have learned about since. There was a French whale on a Polymarket, which is sort of a prediction market betting kind of site. Um, and he staked like tens of millions of dollars on Trump winning very like relatively early, like several months before. And the reason he was able to do this confidently is actually because he basically did a cost benefit analysis where he paid for his own polling. He conducted his own polling. He's obviously a very wealthy person. Um, and his results from his polling were very divergent from what the polls were saying. And so he saw that as an interesting arbitrage opportunity. And I wonder if I would be curious to learn more about what was different about what he did versus what the pollsters who are supposedly professionals are doing. It seems like there is something fundamentally broken there. And maybe if there was some money on the line for them, they would get it right.
Right. It is interesting how those incentives, when they're very directly tied to outcomes, or yeah, in this case, to a specific individual, maybe even you can imagine a pooled group of individuals, investors who have the means to put their money on the line and say, hey, we all want to get in on this opportunity to make a lot of money through this gap between what we are being told and what the reality is on the ground.
Mm.
It calls to mind also, I don't know if you were following this, but the political scientist Alan Lichtman, he has
Mm.
his keys that he comes out with for the election and has, I guess, historically had a good track record. But one of his core assumptions in those keys was that the economy was good. We can get into the specific means by which he assessed that, but it, as I recall, came down in large part to the assertion that the economy has not been in a recession, that jobs numbers have been good, unemployment has been low. I don't think labor participation rate factored into his analysis, which is a very critical thing that tends to be, depending upon your partisan leanings, overlooked in
Yeah.
looking at the last few years of the economy. But I mean, to me,
So
it
in
just,
particular, young men, there's fewer
yeah,
young men even participating in the labor force today than there have
absolutely.
been historically.
So Alex, how old are you?
I'm 31.
31. Okay, so 34 here. We're in a similar position, on the younger side. But I mean, especially when I was talking to college students, aside from the ones who, again, I would say places like Duke University, the elite institutions tend to not be fully representative. But, you talk to people going to like um, universities in North Carolina or Iowa or whatever, just, yeah, more middle class people. And they are just terrified of the possibilities for them economically and especially in terms of housing. That's just the issue that keeps coming up. You
Mm.
know, Obviously hard for everybody, myself not accepted, but for people who, yeah, want to be able to start a family, like support themselves and a family, the indignity of having to not only, and I heard this from people, not only work like a full-time job and struggle and find that your salary is still being eaten up by inflation, but then to have to live in your parents' home for an indefinite period and live through this protracted adolescence, even when you're doing everything right, when you're
Mm.
doing everything you were told you should go do, work hard, go to school, get like a good paying job. There's just way too many people who are in that boat who are not um, in a properly ordered society, you would expect them to be able to meet those like very basic needs that humans have for uh, for living a flourishing life, and that is so obviously failing. And to me, the fact that there is this continued, I would say it subsided a bit since the election results. I think everybody has, even if they're not saying it, everybody has taken a bit of a step back. But that there is this continued insistence, in the famous meme of like the cartoon dog in the house that's on fire saying everything's fine. I
Mm.
mean, you hear that or you get that sense from so many people who I think maybe they feel an incentive, and not even necessarily for partisan reasons, but out of a desire to maintain social order or avoid, overstating how bad things are, because it's possible to do that too. But so many people who I think should be much more open to trying to understand why young people, young men in particular, find that they have been failed or that the system as it stands is not answering their needs. There just needs to be a big reevaluation of all of that, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. And I found it interesting your comments about sort of the future of the Midwest, or what you would call maybe more accurately the Rust Belt states.
Mm-hmm.
I'm from Michigan myself. I spent my first 27 years there, and you know, I I think that there's definitely some sort of move, and maybe it's just due to the necessity of national security and national resource independence, industrial independence from China in particular. Um, there does seem to be some sort of move uh, that's gaining momentum in both government but also in tech, that American industry does need to come back. We need to get, high-end manufacturing back. We need to start bringing back lots of automation, and that will provide uh, high-level manufacturing jobs. And I think you're right about one thing, which is that the parts of the country where people do have those skills, where there's a lot of skilled mechanics and people doing metallurgy and people, mechanical engineers and other things like that, are some of the parts of the country that have not benefited the most from the last sort of tech boom of the last, you know, 30 or 40 years. But what might actually be good, like very ripe ground for an emerging, American advanced manufacturing industry in the 21st century.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a common theme that you're hearing. There's been things like I believe it was the Re-Industrialized conference recently that brought together venture capitalists who I think in general came more from the Silicon Valley world, but you also have, I think in the case of Detroit and Michigan specifically, there
Mhm.
are some wealthy individuals or families who seem to be interested in this, probably in part out of self-interest, but yeah, it seems to me that Michigan in particular is just such a sad story because I don't have the statistics offhand, but it's a state that for a long time has had really excellent fundamentals on paper.
Mhm.
The University of Michigan is a really good school, and
Yeah.
it has been for a long time. It has uh, the distinction, Michigan, of having at one point, I believe, had the wealthiest by per capita income city in the country, and that was Detroit
Mhm.
of mid-century. Um,
And
for
Detroit, by the way, still has some of the most wealthy small towns in its suburbs. The suburbs of Detroit are actually some of the wealthiest counties in
Grosse Pointe
America.
and
Hmm.
Oakland and those places.
Yeah.
Yeah. It certainly seems, I mean, there's a sense in which you have to look at a lot of complex intersecting factors to understand why Detroit has gone wrong, or why there seems to be this huge mismatch. If you can drive so much of GDP growth, and if you're looking solely or especially at just GDP growth, drive that through Silicon Valley, drive that through some, the FANG companies and similar firms, and again drive real innovation in even now artificial intelligence. I mean, I would imagine more up to date on that, but uh, my understanding is that really, despite a lot of advances, even in like Chinese academic labs and other countries, the U.S. still is at least a few years ahead in AI relative to every other country.
Yeah. I mean, we
That's
don't know what they're not showing us, but it
well,
appears we appear to be dominant.
yeah,
Well, so one thing I'll say is there is an acknowledgement right now that specific verticals of AI, I think vision systems and things like that are actually better. There's actually better Chinese technology there. But as far as the large language models, the things that are really becoming popular right now, both for consumers but also businesses, I think we're still pretty dominant. I mean, but again, we don't really know what they're not showing us.
yeah. And when I think about the applications of that sort of yeah, vision computing, whatever, I mean, I guess I could imagine satellite imaging for medicine, but I could also imagine like the scientific and technical basis for large scale surveillance of a population, uh,
Mhm.
which in the hands of any government is bad, but in particular in the hands of the CCP, it's not good. Certainly, it's just disturbing in its own right to wonder just how much might be happening here in the United States that we're not aware of on that front that is being used by, yeah, the NSA or our own agencies. Yeah, to me, but to your earlier point about this gap between Michigan and some of these other Rust Belt states and Silicon Valley, I think there has been an obvious shift in the Trump era. You're seeing from many people, not just Republicans, but on the left, you have at least some, I think, people who are influenced by an earlier generation um, of thinkers on the left that it seems to be a mistake to just prioritize one particular area of development, one particular approach to technological growth, and to leave aside those concrete real world innovations. And you're right. I mean, I think the what I imagine is playing out is that with this, uh, I think both real and perceived national defense gap that is leading to significant investment both from venture capitalists and I think also from the federal government. You're getting then maybe the basis uh, for significant reshoring, but there are also countervailing voices calling for things like nearshoring. And I don't know
Yeah.
if you've heard that term, but yeah, it's the idea we're going to just for maybe labor cost reasons or other reasons try to at least have things made in, say, South Korea or Mexico or something rather than the US, which I mean, that again, I don't think you totally eliminate all of the geopolitical risks associated with not having this hard industrial power in the United States. But yeah, I mean, leaving aside the national security side, leaving aside all of the immediate pressing reasons that people often cite, I think it's reasonable to say, and this is something I'm basing on a conversation I recently had with a tech person. It's reasonable to say, as a starting principle, that you want to have an economy, a society where it's possible for somebody to have like a decent middle class life, building things and contributing within a, a fairly like sustainable, even at like the regional level, economy. And you know, if making that the priority means you shortchange pure GDP growth on paper, if you have to make a trade off there, it might be reasonable to make the trade off. And in fact, we already make the trade off. We've been doing it long before the Trump era on things like subsidies in various industries. I think like the rice industry is a famous example. But yeah, maybe returning to what's often cited as a model, the old American school model of economics, basically downstream of Hamilton, Henry Clay, Henry Carey. Like perhaps there are reasons to not attempt to reproduce all the features of a successful 19th century economic model in the modern United States. But on the other hand, you've seen like a fairly similar playbook used in large scale industrialization and some of the successes that came with that in basically every country that has industrialized,
Mhm.
from Japan to Germany
Right.
to China.
Yeah. Well, I think that's basically it. Is like we should just think very we should try to think very objectively about the structure of the economy and what we want that to look like. If we want everything to just be um, information technology and financial services and like healthcare, well, then you have a very different set of incentives and a different structure for your labor force for those businesses, especially finance and information technology are not very labor intensive. The number of bodies that you have to have at a firm to produce value in those industries is actually tremendously small compared to uh, large scale manufacturing, right? Large scale manufacturing, even with robots and automation and all kinds of other advances that we have that we're getting from tech, large scale manufacturing still requires a tremendously large, mostly horizontal labor force, right? Whereas, a tech company, I mean, when Instagram sold to Facebook for I think like $1 billion, I think they had less than 20 employees, right? And so if you think about, you know, that compared to a factory, even a very modern high tech factory, you just have to employ so many more people. And it's obvious that that's more stable for your society, better for the men and women that are going to compose your society, that aspire to own homes and have families, but also just overall better for the stability and the security of your country to have control over its manufacturing and supply chains.
Yeah, no, I think, well, for one thing, this is, I have a few tangents I could go off here, but often a counterpoint you'll hear in relation to at least some policies aimed at accomplishing what you've described is, well, if you have, and I think there's a lot of debate to be had about what an attempt to reindustrialize would look like, to what extent government intervention should be involved, and what is most efficient, most appropriate, least likely to distort things and to pick winners and losers. But if you're beginning from the assumption that okay, the alternative would be what you just described, and that's what the free market would accomplish, and we would then have a flourishing city state like San Francisco. Well, I mean, in practice, you find that what are the ancillary benefits from something like Instagram producing that small number of very wealthy employees? This is an oversimplification, but if you have a service-driven economy dependent on very cheap labor, but nested within a welfare state, then yeah, you might have like you know a marginally higher number of baristas who then have to rely on maybe SNAP or other government benefits to be able to survive in this sort of place where there's a small number of multimillionaires thanks to Instagram. And so
Mm.
you just still end up, and that's even leaving aside, the role, as I'm sure you're well aware, of various forms of government subsidy and the security state of the Cold War in seeding the Silicon Valley thing to begin with. But
Yeah.
it just seems to me like you're really realistically never going to get away from various forms of government intervention, and ones that just kind of attempts to kind of cloak that by discarding industrial policy as some sort of radical change in the direction of uh, dispossessing people who have simply been able to operate within a fully free market context. Yeah, it just doesn't wash for me. And to your other point, yeah, it's probably significantly less socially harmonious to have a small number of multimillionaires and then people who are baristas living on some degree of government subsidy in many cases.
Right. The
And
employment numbers are good. Look how many DoorDash drivers we have.
right, exactly,
Right.
DoorDash drivers who don't use their real names because in many cases they're not here legally.
Mm.
And again, they're you know that's the decisions that have been made by policymakers in everything from the scope and nature of the welfare state to our immigration policy. And I think it reflects to me this what has been rejected pretty firmly attempts to Californify the country.
Mm.
And again, California is a state that still has and certainly began with really excellent fundamentals. I think at mid-century, the best education system in the country, in a country that was at the top of education in the world. But
Mm.
now they're ranked, I believe, 49th or maybe even 50th in
Oh,
many
wow.
educational rankings. And you have the not total, but um, large scale elimination of what I would call like the core traditional middle class. And I think the decision, regardless of the putative progressivism of a lot of the policies, to have a state that is greatly divided between a very small number of wealthy people and basically a permanent lower class that includes a significant number of people who have come into the country, maybe technically legally under some sort of asylum program or under other designations, but people who, in effect, the decision has been made that people who are in a gray area with respect to citizenship, among other things, provide very cheap labor and are just easier to deal with
Mm.
than a population of middle class, self assertive citizens. And yeah, that to me just feels like a total betrayal of what the United States is and should be about. But again, that's just me pontificating here.
Mm. So I want to ask you a little bit about your one of your subbeats, which is energy. You mentioned the National Energy Council. Energy is also one of those topics that seems to have been long neglected, if not forgotten about entirely, but now is re emerging. Um, there's of course uh, a lot of debate about what the future of energy in the United States should look like. Um, and so I guess to start, without me inserting like my own positions on this, I just want to ask you a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of the future of energy and energy policy here in the United States.
So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see just the near term effects of the change at the Department of Energy, the Department of the Interior, and with the emergence of this National Energy Council. For one thing, there will be, I think, some pretty quick steps taken, rescission of Biden executive orders related to oil and gas drilling, but also the pause of natural gas exports from the United States. I would imagine, will probably be I mean, the term that you often hear from Republican lawmakers, at least, is all of the above energy policy. So, and again, to return to an earlier theme, many of these things involve, government subsidies to some degree or another, or, perhaps in some cases, you could make the case that they should have more government subsidies or be discouraged by the government. But in practice, it does seem as though the grid is likely to work out to a mixture of different things, some combination of renewables, nuclear energy, increasingly options such as geothermal, which, as I understand it, benefits technologically from a lot of the innovations involved in the fracking revolution. But I would expect probably more of an orientation towards uh, towards oil and gas. I guess to my mind, the really interesting thing here is that you have in Doug Burgum, the incoming Secretary of the Interior, and Chris Wright, the incoming, and I should say these are both going to require Senate confirmation, most likely, but the likely incoming Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, both of them are techies. Burgum, before he became North Dakota governor, he had a software company that was eventually sold to Microsoft. He is, if you actually look into some of his own approaches to everything from energy in North Dakota with its, relatively rapid transformation in the scale of hydrocarbon extraction, but also things like urbanism and housing. He's a very, very interesting figure. And that is, we can talk about this later, but that's going to factor into, I believe, any sort of movement towards large scale freedom cities, as Trump promised on the campaign trail, basically an attempt to build at a large scale chartered cities or something similar to that in the United States against the backdrop of this housing crisis. But then in Chris Wright, the Secretary of Energy, you're going to have someone who is a major fracking figure tied in with Harold Hamm, who's on the oil industry scene in the fracking world, very influential, major GOP donor. He's also involved in geothermal. He's involved in small modular reactors. This is, I mean, to my mind, going to be a very critical period of time for any attempt to go beyond merely a lot of early bureaucratic movements in the direction of things like small modular reactors, other advanced nuclear technologies, away from just what has been, from my understanding after speaking with people in the nuclear energy industry, some positive trends from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and other actors. But you really, there are going to have to be some like significant changes made in the direction of ensuring that there is a domestic supply chain. So Russia is, and has been for a long time, this massive global player in nuclear energy, building plants all across the world. They, among other things, have effectively a monopoly on the fuel used in advanced reactors. This fuel called high assay low enrichment uranium, or HALEU. And Bill Gates, his TerraPower company, was, I believe, delayed because of the lack of access to this domestically. There has been a ban put in place, though there are waivers that are going to be in place until 2028 on Russian radioactive materials, HALEU and all that sort of stuff. But and despite the fact that there is now an attempt to like seed HALEU companies and move forward on that domestically, it's still kind of an open question, like how fast is this going to move? Are there other steps that can be taken to really expedite this, if you're serious about nuclear energy and advanced nuclear energy, serious gap that exists on the domestic side? And that's something I've written a bit about. I think there's more optimism. One man I spoke with, James Walker with Nano Nuclear, he thinks that there's going to be, as somewhat dovetailing element of this attempt to reindustrialize and through tariffs and other means to ensure that the U.S. is a little more self-sufficient, significant pressure perhaps brought to bear on just HALEU alone, just this one rather critical element of any sort of advanced nuclear supply chain. And so it'll be interesting to see, like, what does someone like Chris Wright do? I mean, a related question, of course, is to what extent is Chris Wright himself, will his portfolio of companies benefit from some of this? And I think it's, good to scrutinize that and kind of, and also in the case of DOGE, scrutinize, to what extent someone like Elon Musk might benefit from certain rules being changed or players being advantaged. But all that being said, to my mind, it's very exciting and likely promising that you have people like Wright, Burgum, Musk, Ramaswamy, people who come from the tech world, bringing their perspective to bear on a lot of these issues that for a long time have been intractable, have come to become more and more difficult. Just, nuclear reactors alone have been, despite the fact that, as in so many other cases, the United States pioneered the technology, effectively, if not impossible, very, very difficult to build. The most recent ones that were built in Georgia a few years ago,
Hmm.
it took, I believe, 15 years from the very beginning of the process of moving through the bureaucracy to realize these. And these were not unconventional reactors. This was like,
Yeah.
old, I believe, light water, large scale reactor technology, rather than some of these advanced reactors that require more steps, that require more approvals to go forward.
Well, I'm equally hopeful as you are for, getting easier and more modular ways to build nuclear power and nuclear reactors. I think, the solution is going to lie somewhere in nuclear. I have less strong opinions about sort of, gas exports and intensifying, you know, exploitation of our existing reserves. I am always a little sympathetic to the idea that we may be inadvertently reducing our strategic reserves by doing some of these actions and trading sort of short-term economic gain for long-term um, security. But I really don't know enough, honestly, to say one way or the other. But what I do know is that nuclear seems to be the answer, and getting energy costs down for everybody is just will just tremendously jumpstart our economy. I mean, it can't be emphasized enough how important it is to have cheap energy.
Yeah, and it's again, it dovetails with national security. This is a theme, you might be surprised coming out of like just the media landscape and the responses to some of these Trump policies, but in a surprisingly large number of mainstream, large Washington think tanks, this way of linking energy to national security to prosperity, it's not exactly like all that difficult a jump to make. It's not like rocket science to understand, okay, these things are linked together. And in the case of the United States, there is, just through hydrocarbons, but also through other resources and through effectively bringing home a lot of technologies and processes that were initially developed in the United States, you could both make the country more self-sufficient and then reduce the pressure that can be brought to bear on it by various foreign countries. In the case of renewables, a significant amount of that is dependent upon China, not just, I should emphasize, for like raw materials mining, but also for those processes, refining the production of actual solar panels, for example,
Yeah.
which effectively over the past few years, despite
China essentially killed the U.S. solar
yes, it did.
industry
Yeah.
by undercutting U.S. solar producers on price.
And at least over the past few years, it has been possible for companies to do final assembly of technologies of products in Vietnam or some other country, even though a lot of the previous fabrication, basically everything up until the point where you have to bypass trade restrictions in the U.S., happens in China. It's not a good thing. It's a huge vulnerability, especially with solar becoming such an integral part, I would say, of the grid as a whole, but just having all these, different specialized applications in areas where you might need to run various things off of a centralized grid, which is another potential area for a lot of these micro reactors and other advanced reactor technologies to play a role as an alternative, for example, in very small communities in northern Alaska to having to rely on just diesel generators or something. Nuclear reactors might be part of the solution there. A significant amount of interest, of course, is in the notion of using nuclear reactors, maybe sort of as an ancillary part of also using natural gas flaring to power data centers
Yeah.
and basically enable something like the level of energy that, as I understand it, artificial intelligence is increasingly requiring and will almost certainly require for the U.S. to continue to maintain dominance in that area.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we do need a tremendous amount of energy to continue providing massive, computation basically for both running as well as training large models. So part of the AI future will also be tied to this notion of U.S. energy independence and production. So I want to talk to you a little bit about DOGE. You mentioned it briefly a few minutes ago. And I know that you've done some coverage on Doge as well. There's a lot of talk about Doge online lately. Obviously, Elon has been talking about it almost nonstop since before the election, but also after, quite enthusiastically. And him and Vivek, have been seen in DC, no doubt making the rounds and letting it be known that they're going to be coming in and making some big changes. But there's still a little bit of skepticism about how serious Doge is as a project, what it actually means, what kind of constitutional powers they really have. I personally actually got a very nasty email from from one of my potential customers for my startup Lawgiver because we were sort of positioning ourselves as a potential force for deregulation or at least simplifying the regulatory code. And so we were very excited to hear about Doge. I had been, you know, working on this for months before Doge was even announced, um, and wanted to participate. And of course, I would love to get involved in any way that I can help. If someone from the administration is listening and wants to contact me, please reach out. But um, I was chastised essentially by an individual who felt that it was both inappropriate for my company to be associating ourselves with this new agency that may or may not come to fruition, and then and additionally also raised some potential misgivings about their constitutional authority. And so I wanted to just take the opportunity to ask you, you know, what is your view from the outside? Obviously, you're closer to this both as a journalist, but also being in DC. Um, how serious is Doge? What do you think they will get done? And do you think that Elon and Vivek will be able to do everything that they're saying they're going to do, or is it more of a publicity stunt?
Well, I think that anything that gets accomplished in American life involves some publicity stunt, right? You know, we
Mm,
are we are the country of P.T. Barnum. I guess that doesn't sound so positive, but let's
mm,
say other great self-promoters as well, even someone like, Thomas Edison, and also Nikola Tesla, to be fair. I think that it's like as a starting point for somebody looking at the problem of the debt deficit, government efficiency, there is a significant amount of non-discretionary spending that it's not realistic to expect Doge being able to touch. A lot of this is, spending related to the welfare state, social programs. Not as much of it is, yeah, defense as some people might expect, although it is a big, significant chunk of money that's spent in the budget every year.
mm,
So that is a useful starting point. And again, this is to your point about its constitutional authority. Unless something changes once the new Senate, once the new House are able to start acting, it is going to be a time limited presidential commission. It's, as I understand it, not going to be anything beyond that. And there have been a lot of presidential commissions. They don't have as much capacity to really affect change necessarily just
mm,
by the way that they're constituted as a formal federal department or, for example, something like the Government Accountability Office, which has been spotlighting many of these efficiency issues for a long time. And if you're interested in diving into the numbers, there are many Government Accountability Office reports that have things worth scrutinizing. All that being said, one comment that one I believe senator made stands out to me, which is okay. Leaving all that aside, leaving the scale of this, and then the relative scales of some of these other departments that are under scrutiny. Bearing in mind the just probably basic limitations in terms of addressing the underlying causes of the debt and deficit. Maybe this though does potentially through significant cuts that don't impede meaningful government services, through efforts to streamline, in particular through using AI to really cut through a lot of bureaucratic processes, while I would hope maintaining a human in the loop or some layer of accountability that doesn't entirely leave decision making to AI. I think that's a very reasonable basis for skepticism of talking about AI in these contexts. But yeah, if this is a successful thing, if especially given the fact that the Republicans now have a trifecta, if they are able to then leverage this, if perhaps the White House, through whatever tools are at its disposal, um, approaching now the agencies with a more vigorous Office of Management and Budget headed by Russ Vaught. If all of that can come together, and at the very least, in some of these relatively smaller but still very large departments, make some of these changes, then yeah, there could be more buy-in in the future for cutting into more significant areas of spending. But again, even in that area, it's such an intractable problem addressing just the fiscal stability of Social Security. I believe the trust fund is expected to run out within the next 10 years, although that keeps being moved far into the future. And there are reasonable points to be made about over the years the Social Security Trust Fund being rated for other programs and its fiscal sustainability not entirely having been compromised by itself structurally. But at the end of the day, it is a program that is dependent upon a smaller, older population, a larger, younger population than we have now. And so, yeah, how do you address that without creating a lot of problems for retired or disabled Americans? How do you getting to the point of making some of these big changes? It will take more than DOGE, but it does seem as though, for example, there's a DOGE Senate caucus, I believe, that has been formed. People are able to, crowdsource various areas where it appears that there are significant inefficiencies. Relative to or related to our conversation a few moments ago, I spoke with someone in the nuclear industry who, he expressed some reservations about what DOGE could do, some concerns that, for example, the bureaucracies that are impacted might in some cases be useful and effective. I've run into the argument, for example, that the Bureau of Mines, which was eliminated in the mid 1990s, was actually a very useful coordinating body for approving mining projects. And so one reason why it's been so difficult to open mines in the United States over the past few decades is the lack of an effective bureaucracy.
Hmm.
But I did actually ask him, okay, what about the idea of running some of these various permitting processes, licensing processes, all these massive stacks of paper that you need this large staff to slowly work through over the years. Like, what if AI was used to expedite that process? And he speculated to me that maybe you could have an order of magnitude change in the headcount at perhaps the National Nuclear Regulatory Commission or some of these other agencies. I think that DOGE is kind of a proof of concept in my mind for some of these changes that you see, not just Republicans, but also I believe Ro Khanna and Dean Phillips and some Democrats have said that they believe need to be made at some stage. And in many cases, I think it was Cenk Uygur pointed out the level of apparent inefficiencies just in like the defense spending and kind of that security state spending. Like, yeah, there does seem to be bipartisan energy behind the issue. And if some of that involves a little bit of BS artistry from good self-promoters, maybe the results within the next few years will speak for themselves, and we'll be able to really assess just how meaningful it ends up being.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, they'll at least they'll at least maybe uncover a lot of the waste and inefficiency that's going on, and maybe that'll just be enough to get the the ball rolling on it.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's not a coincidence that we've arrived at this point when just over the past few years, the debt has, I think, in maybe 4 or 5 years, increased from something like 26 to 34 or 35 billion or trillion rather.
Yeah.
Yes, we need to add a few
Yeah,
more
D
zeros.
is too small. You need a TR
Exactly.
at the
Mm-hmm.
at the beginning. Um,
Interest payments on the debt are now exceeding annual defense spending.
yeah,
That's the sort of thing. I was at a Brookings Institution event, and not a conservative think tank by any means. This was brought up by panelists who were maybe on the center left. I think a lot of people, regardless of like partisanship, they recognize a common set of problems. And the debt and deficit, even just in the past, I mean, it's been a perennial issue that people like Thomas Massey have brought up, but just in the past, in the epoch of the COVID response, it's become so pressing that yes, this creates the political environment not only for someone like Elon Musk to jump on board of a Trump campaign, but for there then to be this increasing, I think, bipartisan pressure to do something, anything about it.
Yeah, and I want to talk to you a little bit about the debt, because the narrative that's coming out, and again, also driven by this very interesting, sort of transplant of Silicon Valley elites into uh, the White House, especially, um, which is this notion of growing our way out of this. That's the phrase that I keep hearing is like we obviously have a serious debt problem. We're running deficits all over the place. The interest on the debt is starting to become unmanageable. And what I'm hearing is, yeah, okay, we could try to cut spending, we could try to pull back some of these programs, but ultimately there are certain obligations and there are certain structures that are fixed, and there's only so much we can do as far as cost cutting. Really, the way that we're going to get out of this is by growing the economy, right? Creating more jobs, more prosperity, more GDP. Um, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, are you hopeful?
Well, I guess I would turn back to the example of the US economy after World War II and what people anticipated. There was widespread concern about large scale unemployment from soldiers coming home. This had also been, I think, a significantly more state managed economy beginning during the Great Depression and then continuing through World War II than the US had ever seen. You had, extremely high top marginal tax rates, uh, yeah, large scale growth of the federal government and of new agencies in a way that, I think it's fair to say may have biased the perspectives of the sense making apparatus at the time. But as it turned out, people were released from the military and they went and they started families. They got jobs, many in a different environment than the one that we're in now. Much larger industrial base, much larger union penetration, but they were able to then fuel. I would say primarily just through people being people, Americans being Americans, uh, a significant economic boom that
Hmm.
lasted and continued. And yeah, I mean, you can point out that there were other factors weighing in favor of the U.S. The other large industrialized economies were in ruins, but that I would say tends to shortchange the extent to which that was a positive signal of what people do when they're maybe a little bit freer than they had been previously. And I don't know, make it, at least to me, I come away maybe more optimistic. I do think that it's a mistake in the end to bet against the United States, especially when it comes to economic dynamism.
Hmm.
Just comparing, yeah, relative growth and various other indices of economic prosperity and success between Europe and the U.S. over the past 2 decades or so. They started out, I believe, at relative GDP parity not that long ago, and the picture looks very, very different in Europe than in the United States. And what is different in Europe? Well, among other things, Germany has shut down its nuclear power plants. There's a very different regulatory environment. Maybe the intentions are good, but certainly you don't hear people in Europe bragging about the number of tech startups that they have.
Hmm.
It seems like everybody talented, in some cases explicitly to avoid what amounts to confiscatory taxation, moves to the US, or if not the US, then Canada, followed by the US if they can. That hasn't changed. And it would, I think, take a lot to displace the US. This is not exactly parallel to the World War II, but at least in part because of mistakes Europe has made, right? That the US is still in a relatively good position. And there is this growing, I think, sense of concern about being technologically bypassed by China or economically overly dependent. Yeah, all of these factors, I think, are coming together to make me maybe not. I wouldn't call myself like Pollyanna-ish about the idea of rocketing through advanced growth. I don't know if I'm at the point of believing that in a few years none of us will have jobs because AI has taken over everything. But yeah, I mean, you're shaking your head there, so I take it you agree.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I think unfortunately the AI future where we all are not working is very far away, if not totally illusory.
yeah, and again, that calls to mind. I think it was even as early as the 1930s, it might have been John Maynard Keynes or another economist who was speculating that we were all moving towards the 4-hour work week, and it would just be a few years, and then it would be a reality. There's yeah, I guess I would say
Well,
that
the problem is that work expands to fill available space.
there we go. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to go off in too abstract of a direction here, but there is something about Americans. I think there's like an agitated energy to them that, leads Americans to just do things, hopefully positive things. But
Yeah.
there's, yeah, I think there's something in the American spirit that hasn't been totally killed that argues in favor of expansion and achievement
Mm.
and doing things.
Yeah. Well, that's great. That's a great optimistic note. All right, Nathan, where can people find you and what more can we expect to see from you soon?
Well, you can find me at theepochtimes.com. That's EPOCH.
Mhm.
I've got an author page there. I mentioned the conversation I had earlier with someone involved in the tech world. There's a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of interest, maybe not so much investment at this point, but the beginnings of investment in something like the Freedom Cities vision
Mm.
that Trump laid out on the campaign trail. At the time there was some skepticism, I would say warranted about what is this going to look like? Are people talking about using federal land to put cities in the middle of nowhere? How do you overcome regulatory constraints on growth? But yeah, I think at this point, especially just given the environment on housing, there's a lot more energy, people seeing a lot of opportunity, and also people who, yeah, for idealistic reasons, really want to see something new and something like large scale growth of charter cities is not unprecedented. It might seem a little bit impossible now in the U.S., but certainly there have been successful charter cities across the world. There's actually been some interesting legislation, some interesting models coming out of various federal lawmakers and states. So I'm looking into that, continuing to track the cabinet appointments and just how this new Trump administration is taking shape. And another interesting element is, of course, the whole Trump world openness now to scientists and academics and figures who were previously, I guess you could say, at odds with the agencies that they may now soon be leading. Of course, the
Mm.
most famous example is Robert F. Kennedy Jr.,
Yes.
possibly leading the Department of Health and Human Services. But you also have, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, Dr. Martin McCary, Dr. Dave Weldon. And then historically, the Trump administration has employed people who were, I guess you could say, heterodox or dissident thinkers, people like Darren Beatty, who is
Mm.
now with Revolver News and a figure in the conservative commentary space. I mean, I'm just really excited to get a sense of what is driving this, and also, I'm interested in whether or not there's going to be kind of a shifting in the sense making apparatus or the way that academia works, the way that we arrive at knowledge and put it to use. I think based upon the failures of the past few years and how, I mean, if we're looking at an administration that is, yeah, more open to heterodox perspectives, how is that going, is that going to translate to things in the real world in terms of policy? Are we going to see, for example, um, restaffing of federal agencies with people who have a different point of view? I would imagine there will be significant, legal battles and resistance mediated through the media and various other forms of pushback to that if it does happen in a serious way. But yeah, as compared even to 2016, I feel like the stakes on that are higher. There's a lot more dissatisfaction, I think, within academia with, I guess you could say, wokeness or the kind of push against excellence, the push against the positive side of tradition that
Mhm.
even among people who would call themselves liberal or people who are typically Democrats, I think there is a level of disaffection that it will be interesting to see how it ends up informing the next few years when it comes to things like academia, science, the way that science and engineering policy plays out within the Trump White House and this coming Congress. That's yeah, those are, to answer your question in a very lengthy way. those are some of the things that I'm looking into, and there could be some interesting international reporting coming soon, and I'll post about that on my Twitter account or X, I guess,
Hmm.
uh, when it happens. You can follow me there at NN Worcester, and that's NNWORCESTER. Just utterly unpronounceable, unfortunately, but that's generally where I post stuff and do things on social media. So yeah, I think it's going to be a very interesting December, and then 2025. This first 6 months of the Trump administration may be that time when really defining moves end up being made, and we can start to judge what sort of gap there is between promises on the campaign trail, the kind of energy that exists now, and the actual reality. But we're
Hmm.
still in early days.
All right. Well, Nathan, this has been awesome. And obviously there's a lot of exciting things coming. You're really well informed, close to you've got your ear close to the things that are happening on the ground. And I just really appreciate you coming on the show. This has been awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Would be glad to do it again soon, and hopefully there will be more concrete things in terms of policy to talk about at that point. But yeah,
Yeah.
certainly an interesting time to be in DC.
Come back and we'll talk about the changes that actually happen. All right. Take care. See ya.